Well, thanks for joining us, Fergus. We're speaking today with gaming legend Fergus McNeill, who's had a very long career. We'll start at the beginning, if that's okay. How did you get into computers? What was your introduction to computers?
Um, when I was a young lad, about 1,000 years ago, my parents bought me a ZX81, and I was hugely excited about a ZX81. And as soon as I got enthused about that, Sinclair brought out the ZX Spectrum. So I then became a hugely ungrateful child and kept asking for a Spectrum as a replacement for the practically brand new ZX81. And back in those days, it was literally possible to just go and get magazines with short games programs in them, which you would type in laboriously, and then spend hours trying to figure out where you'd made a typo, trying to fix it. And I think that was a subliminal way of teaching us how code worked, was debugging your own mistakes that you'd made when typing things in from magazines. So after a while, I started to change some of the things that I was typing in, because I wanted to make it a little bit my own, changing the color of this, the position of that, how many enemies would show up on level 3, all that kind of stuff. And from there, it just kind of went on from there. I always wanted to make adventure games. That was always a huge thing for me, because I'd played, I think, was it Greedy Gulch by Phipps Associates that I'd played something way back when, and then obviously playing The Hobbit was really the deciding factor for me, in terms of, at that moment, I thought, this is brilliant. I want to make something a little bit like this. So yeah, that was how I got started. You have to remember there were fewer TV channels back in those days, no streaming services, no internet, so we were really bored. So it was either that or whittling or something.
And then you start writing games on the BBC.
So I was doing, so I was still at school when all this happened. And I started ZX81, ZX Spectrum, but then I started doing my computer studies O level. And for people who don't know what O levels are, that was the thing that came before GCSEs and GCEs and stuff like that. So an educational qualification about computer studies, and computer studies was very new back in those times. And we had access to a whole classroom full of BBC Model B micros, which I cannot tell you how much nicer the keyboard was on the BBC. It was so lovely. But it only had 32K, so it felt like a bit of a step down from the Spectrum. But for my computer studies project, we had to do various projects. I started writing a game for like my O-level project, and actually did manage to get a working game in. And that contributed for me passing my O-level, despite the fact that my computer studies teacher hated me.
Right.
So it was quite fortunate that I already had some understanding of BASIC from the Spectrum. But that was my only foray into BBC stuff. After that, because I didn't own one, and because my paper round wouldn't really sort of afford yet another computer at that time, all the BBC stuff was done by one of my school friends, who his parents had bought him a BBC because it was more educational.
Right.
So yeah, he did the BBC versions for a while.
So how did you get programming on the Spectrum then, all the adventure games? How did all that come about?
I think it probably was The Hobbit that was the deciding factor. That and the fact that um, it always seemed an attainable goal to focus on adventure games, whereas there were people out there in the space. Obviously, Ultimate Play the Game was a big player. Also, people like Design. I don't know if you remember Dark Star. One of their games was just insane, fast frame rate, 3D things happening in the border, which you couldn't do on the Spectrum. It was crazy, and there were so many really, really talented arcade game makers, and I knew that I would never be able to catch up on that side of things. Whereas I guess it's playing to your strengths a little bit. I was always the class clown and joker. So when the notion of putting a little bit of humor into an interactive text adventure, when I stumbled on that, it kind of gave me an avenue in.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than squander that and be a somebody who was doing not very good arcade games, I figured I could do slightly less not very good adventure games. So that was the way I went.
And how would you go about designing an adventure game?
um, so it was usually a question of having an understanding of the story that I was, well, either the story I was telling or the story I was parodying, depending on whether it was, more original or less original. Um, so um, with something like the Boggit, which is a parody of The Hobbit, then you kind of know that you're going to start off at Bag End and you're going to end up going to the Lonely Mountain to battle the dragon and stuff. Whereas with something like Robin of Sherlock, which is a parody of both Robin Hood and Sherlock Holmes in one game, you have that kind of original freedom to go and do what you want. But in both cases, the process was largely the same, which was figure out the kind of major beats of the story, the kind of high points that you want to send a player through. And then I would always draw little maps on A4 paper with squares, and each square was a location, and then I'd have the connections leading to the next location, and that would evolve into a large map.
Mm.
Doing that would usually be the first thing, and as I was designing the map, I would cover the map with little scribbles of, oh, this has to happen here and this has to happen here, and there's an enemy here and an object to pick up there, and so on. That would usually be the starting point. And regardless of whether it was something I was writing very badly myself or using a third-party piece of software like the Quill or Professional Adventure Writer, I would try and get that sort of skeleton put together first, get that working, and then kind of build it up in layers. I've never been very good at starting at the beginning and working straight through to the end. I like to build up layer upon layer upon layer of stuff.
Mm.
So it would usually be that kind of process, whereby the game would be solvable fairly early on, and then I would just keep going back and adding more stupid stuff on top of more stupid stuff, until basically it got to the point where I was running out of ideas, and that was usually when I called it quits.
Due to the open nature of adventure games, was it quite? Because a lot of the gags in your games were sort of set piece gags, weren't they? That they were triggered at a certain point. Was it difficult to steer the player towards those trigger points when playing the game?
Um, it's difficult for me to say now because I didn't really have the same connection and feedback with audiences back in the day.
Yeah.
Um, we had some people who would write us letters. Delta 4 got quite a lot of mail, but it was like, pieces of paper in envelopes with stamps delivered by a man with a hat. So on that kind of feedback loop, people don't always converse and you can't get into a conversation about stuff. But I do feel like a lot of the jokes at least got seen. Whether or not they landed, I don't know, but they at least got seen. And I think the process, as I went on, I got better at setting things up and steering people towards it. But when I started out, I'm sure I was terrible, because I was 15. So I was 15, trying to pass my O levels. I had just transferred schools. Girls were a problem, because they're very distracting. All these various sort of things, and all the emotional maturity and life experience of a 15-year-old doesn't really necessarily put you in the driving seat for crafting humor. But people seem to laugh from time to time, and the reviewers didn't hate most of the stuff. So I kind of felt like I was greatly encouraged by the people who played the games and took the time to write in, people who we met at the shows, all of that, I think helped pull me forward to start taking it seriously. Whereas it had begun very much as a bit of a laugh, and then it kind of developed from there over a year or two into me actually trying to take it seriously and actually trying to do a slightly more planned and thoughtful job. But I made some terrible mistakes, some absolutely terrible mistakes, and I just have a huge apology to everybody who ever got on the wrong end of the we had this thing of setting up so that if you typed various words into games, there would be bespoke replies, usually around swear words or things like that. And I was told that the games buyer at Boots, which was actually quite a relatively big seller of games back in those days, didn't like anything to do with swearing and was really unhappy about some of the comments that were flashing up on screen. So at the last minute, we changed things that if you typed a swear word into I can't remember which game it was, but one of the games, if you typed a swear word in, it would actually launch a call to reset your computer with and again, as probably a 15 or 16-year-old at the time, I thought that was entirely funny because it would get the buyer from Boots. What I had forgotten about was the fact that any single or word is in the quill is reduced to its first 4 letters, and we had an elaborate swearing system, which one of the things was break wind. If it found break wind, it equate that as, oh, that's a rude thing that the Boots buyer might not like, so reset your computer. What I hadn't taken into account was the fact that it was necessary later on in the game to break a window, and breaking a window and breaking wind if you're only looking at the first four letters, are exactly the same. So for people affected years and years ago, I'm sorry this apology is late, but I apologize.
Going back to Robin of Sherlock, how did that come about? I mean, that's really weird merging of two different stories, isn't it?
Yes, so I'm sure I'm the first person who's spotted the clear and obvious connection between Robin and Sherlock Holmes. But yeah, we were kind of, I guess we were undecided about which way to go for that difficult second game, and I think the adventure landscape at the time. We were looking at what was coming along, and obviously Scott Adams was doing a Robin Hood with Adventure International. Melbourne House were talking about, I can't remember if it was out beforehand, it was just, those seemed to be big and interesting targets for a parody. And yeah, so we were unable to decide. So we decided that we would merge them together and make one slightly bizarre about the Lincoln green clad Sherwood Forest based gentleman who was out to solve mysteries near Nottingham. And it was a very, very strange game because basically instead of the usual kind of where you have a very clearly defined story that you're working with, this came in where it was a lot of different sectors from a stories, which then to be woven together in some way. And I think that was probably
Oh. Oh, still there?
I'm still here. I don't know what.
It keeps flashing up that you've got low bandwidth at your side.
At my side. Okay. Hold on. I'm just going to run a quick speed test in the background.
Yeah.
Because I should be okay. Unless Virgin are being hateful. One sec. Was looking okay. Sorry about this.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah, it's okay. It reckons I've got a really good internet connection now.
It's all right. We can carry
on. Did you get enough on Robin of Sherlock, or do you want to do that one again?
Yeah, is it all right to again if the sound was
yeah, yeah.
Oh, sorry, mate. Sorry. Right. Okay. So, how did Robin of Sherlock come about? Because obviously that's a really weird sort of merging of two different stories, isn't it?
I'm glad you asked me about Robin of Sherlock. Really glad. So the difficult second game after Lord of the Rings, we were looking at what we were going to do, and the adventure landscape at the time had various players. We were looking at the titles that were coming out because we like the idea of parodying games as well as just sort of brands or stories or books or whatever. And Scott Adams with Adventure International was doing a Robin Hood game, and Melbourne House was doing the long-awaited Sherlock game. So we were kind of torn between those, and basically, to cut a long story short, we decided to cut both stories together and make them into one slightly bizarre fusion. I'm sure lots of people had thought about the obvious connections between detectives and outlaws, but we took that bold step of going in there and making one game out of them. I think it was slightly different to the usual process, because normally you're thinking about an established story with an established beginning, middle, and end. This time round, though, we had the opportunity to do more a load of different set pieces that then kind of could play out in a sequence, which I think was actually probably quite good for the game. But it also pushed us towards trying to figure out how you would play in a non-linear way. And we were using the quill, and we figured out, and I think I'm the first person to ever do this. I figured out that if you set up part 1, 2, and 3 of your quill game with common locations and objects, you could load the save game from one part and load it into the other, and it would pick up where you'd come from, make sure you had your inventory all together, all your variables would stay consistent. So we actually made a game that you could play backwards, forwards, any way you wanted. And that suited the slightly bizarre nature of Robin of Sherlock, to say the least.
So when did you make the decision to sell the games then? When did it strike you that these would be commercial?
Well, started out early on, just selling the games mail order. Back in those days, a lot of games were sold mail order. There were just loads of adverts in the back of computing magazines, with a few lines of text, and an address to send your check or postal order to, and you had to send it off and wait for a couple of weeks, and then the game would show up in a jiffy bag. And I started doing that just because I wanted some other people to play the games. Once you've had all your friends play it, then you kind of think, well, it'd be quite nice to get a little bit of money in here and there. And again, I was at school. My paper round paid terribly badly, and this just seemed like a slightly better alternative. But I never had any real aspirations. However, I sent some games off to some of the magazines that were popular at the time, and I actually managed to get a couple of reviews, which was really, really surprising to me. I hadn't expected them to be reviewed, but it was one of those things where I used to get Popular Computing Weekly every week and read that, and Sinclair User and Crash and all the kind of the magazines that you'd expect. And I can't remember for sure, but I'm fairly confident in saying that it was Popular Computing Weekly that gave me that first review. Totally unexpected. It would have been for, I think, the Dragonstar trilogy. And I was so shocked by it, but also really encouraged. So then I started sending review copies more regularly, just on the off chance that it would get me some publicity, because I noticed that I could sell a lot more copies if the game had been reviewed. People would then kind of inquire, and I was getting a few postal orders through. It was great. Then one day I was sitting in registration at school, and I used to go to the newsagent on my way to school. So I picked up my magazines, went down, was sitting in registration and reading through the magazines, and I turned in Micro Adventure. I turned like a page over, and there was a full double page spread about Quest for the Holy Joystick.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And I just went, yes. Class. Like, teacher looked over and went, have you got anything you'd like to share with the class, Fergus? And I went, yes, and held up the magazine for everybody to see. And that was like one of the few moments where I was vaguely cool at school. So after that, it seemed like it would be stupid not to continue. And that was what then led me to I guess come to the attention of some of the game publishers that were out there at the time, and led me actually to doing this, not just mail order, but actually getting to sell stuff in shops.
Ah, yeah. So it was CRL, wasn't it? The first one that you had a partnership with.
Yeah. So it's been long enough now that I can tell the true story behind this, but.
Right.
I did actually. CRL were running an advert in the back of magazines saying, "Have you written a game? Send us a copy of your game, and we'll talk about whether or not we can publish it." And I had done that, and then been rejected by one of the people at CRL, and then this was probably a month or so before I started. I think I probably got my first Crash Smash just after that. And immediately after that, somebody more senior from CRL got in touch and basically went, do you know, we should probably talk. And so I jumped on the train and went up to London and met Clement Chambers, who hadn't been the person who rejected the game previously. It had just been somebody else at CRL, and Clement basically picked up a very kind of nervous 16-year-old from the tube station, and basically went, you need to write more games and you need to let us publish them. And that was the start of a great. I mean, I'm still friends with Clement to this day. He's a great guy, and we had a lot of fun together. Kind of, I guess, going against the grain of the industry a little bit, doing fun stuff that was entertaining for us at least, and hopefully entertaining for the people who played it. But yeah, we kind of we started off a friendship there, and that then, although Board of the Rings and Robin of Sherlock were published under the Silversoft brand, it was effectively Clement and CRL who were I guess the driving force behind that. Silversoft was kind of an associated publishing label, but yeah, that was great fun, and that actually led to the games getting onto the shelves. So I was able to then go into shops and see kind of packages of games that I'd written in WH Smith and Boots, and it was a lot easier than trying to duplicate games on my old tape-to-tape machine and cutting out photocopied inlays and writing addresses on jiffy bags. So as far as I was concerned, it was brilliant. A lot less work.
Well, Lord of the Rings was, the sort of massive title for you, wasn't it, really? Did you ever get any problems with copyright or anything like that? Because obviously there was a book of the same name and so on.
There was a book of the same name, and I originally was very keen to see if there was a way that we could do something with Harvard Lampoon. Did write to them, never heard back, so had to do something slightly different, although obviously still parodying it. I have to say, because I'm not particularly enamored with Board. I feel like that was before I kind of hit my stride with making jokes land. But I always thought Board of the Rings was way funnier as a book than my humble version that I did. I loved that book. So if you haven't read Board of the Rings, go out and read it. It's brilliant. But hopefully by the time we got to Robin of Sherlock and the Boggit, things were a bit funnier.
Well, you were the first, weren't you, to start making multi-load games, adventure games that I could remember anyway. What was that to do with just basically trying to fit as much in as possible? Because obviously spectrums are quite limited, aren't they, in terms of memory and so on.
Yeah, I've I think I've always found the notion of a hard limit on word count to be quite restrictive.
Yeah.
Um, I was a very voracious reader when I was a kid. So I guess I always wanted to tell stories with similar numbers of words to the books that I was reading. Um, and whilst that's not realistic at all in a text adventure, you do find very quickly that you'll hit that memory limit um, just just doing a very small and not verbose game. This was also in a time before we had text compression operating particularly well. But even with some text compression, I just always wanted to put more stuff in.
Yeah.
There was always a pressure to have graphics because nobody wanted text only games. Everybody was, oh, you've got to have graphics.
Mm.
And the graphics, just a handful of graphics would take up potentially a significant amount of space, which would come out of your word count. So the only way to really not be constantly trying to shave off the odd character here and the odd character there
Mm.
was to go to a multi-part game system. And I also felt it kind of sat nicely within that kind of bringing you to a natural cliffhanger, the end of Act One, the end of the first part of the trilogy, whatever. It felt right, especially with some of the properties that we were looking at. I think it became more of an issue as time went on because obviously for games like the big sleaze, you ended up having to load and save to go back and forward between different areas in New York because the map was effectively split up like that.
Mm.
Um, and whilst that did allow graphics and it did allow a lot of bespoke text,
Mm.
at the same time, it wasn't terribly convenient because tape loading wasn't fast. So, yeah, it's one of those things where you have to compromise somewhere just to fit things into the limited memory. But at least with the multi-load games, I had the opportunity to put in more jokes and not worry about, if I wanted to have, 3-paragraph response to somebody saying hello in a game or something, I could.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you later worked with Terry Pratchett, didn't you, on the Colour of Magic? So how did all that come about?
So um, I had uh, I had been contacted by the guys at Macmillan Group. They were launching a new publishing arm called Piranha,
Mhm.
and they were keen to dip their toe into a number of different game genres, and one of them was adventure games. Um, they contacted us, and um, they were not wanting to do original products as much as they were looking for
Mm.
some interesting licensed properties which would give the games a little bit more marketing support and enable them to bring their new label to prominence. And they literally said, do you have any brands or licenses or anything in
Mm.
mind that would make a good game? And if it's books, any form of books, way better.
Mm.
Uh, and I had just read The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett. And this was before Terry Pratchett was Terry Pratchett. He was
Mm.
he was just Commodore Garden Terry Pratchett in those days. He wasn't recognized as, you know, one of the greatest literary geniuses of our time. Although he still was one of the literary geniuses, he just wasn't recognized.
Yeah.
So I like to think that that probably helped helped our proposal to him that we would like to do a Discworld game. It helped that to have a better shot at working out. In any event, Piranha were as good as their word,
Mm.
and they spoke to Terry's agent, Colin Smythe. And a few weeks later, I remember walking out, blinking into the sunlight outside Bristol Templemead Station. And Terry picked me up in his car, and we went off to have an amazingly excellent pub lunch in some weird old pub where we were eating in a conservatory.
Mm.
And they had several tables. I think there was only 2 or 3 of the tables were occupied, and it was a nice lunch. But at the back of the conservatory, they had these big wingback armchairs with lots of retired generals and majors with big moustaches, all asleep in the sun, sort of basking there, snoring. And everybody had to speak super quietly because they didn't want to wake up any of the important generals who were asleep. And it just seemed, on reflection, like such a Terry Pratchett kind of lunch to have.
Yeah.
And he was a great, fantastic person to work with and just to chat with.
Mm.
Yeah, we got on really well, and I was greatly enthused. However, I am going to say it. I think even I found it confusing. Instead of going north, south, east, and west, to go hubward, rimward, turnwise, and widdershins. Oh my gosh! Even after the game, I was traumatized trying to work out how to do that properly. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I think from my perspective, being in the know about what Terry was doing
Yeah.
in the forthcoming books was just fantastic. So it took all my strength not to be completely distracted by that, because he was a great one for talking about ideas.
And what was he like with technology? I mean, did he like computer games? Did he like computers at all?
Yes, he was a big gamer. He had a great interest, but not just in the software side of things. So as I got to know him a little bit better, he was living, I forget the name of the village, but he was living in a small village somewhere south of Bristol at the time. And he had this wonderful old cottage set into a kind of a slope, and up in the back garden, kind of almost a little bit above the cottage, he had greenhouses, and he used to grow carnivorous plants.
Right.
Again, it's the sort of thing you'd expect, because he was a legend. And he had all these carnivorous plants, and he had taken a ZX81 apart and actually set up a climate humidity control system for his carnivorous plants using a ZX81 to run it on a board and all sorts of stuff. And he later went on to, I believe, upgrade the ZX81 to a Spectrum. So he was a techie dude as well. He was great.
Excellent. So obviously you went on to work in 16-bit and so on, and it was it SCI, the first games you did on 16-bit?
Well, I guess there was a transitional period where we did games that were spanning 8 and 16-bit. So we did some titles with Abstract Concepts, although only one of them was officially released, and that was Mind Fighter. So that was 8-bit and 16-bit game, and Gilsoft, who had done the Quill. Tim Gilbert's there. Was always a genius at getting things to work well on different platforms. So he facilitated the tech that meant that the games could be successfully ported across onto pretty much everything. So we had Atari ST and like the Amiga and stuff like that. I think we even were able to do support for the Amstrad PCW 8256 word processor.
Oh wow!
Because that's what I actually used to write the abstract concept titles, because it was a CP/M based machine, and he could make things work on that. So yeah, great period for that. But that was kind of the swan song for the whole interactive fiction stuff, because at that time the industry was kind of shifting towards a focus on arcade, and big kind of licensed properties and stuff like that, and where previously it had been difficult to get shelf space in high street stores, now it was becoming, with the rationalization of the publishing arm of the industry, it was getting to the stage where you needed real clout to be able to get your titles in there. So it was becoming harder and harder, but we did a number of games that were kind of 16-bit crossovers, and we actually did one Delta 4 game, which was the Smirking Horror. And that was actually written using the same Swan system as Mindfighter and the other abstract concepts titles, but it was never officially released, but it was finished. So there we go. I don't think I got paid for it though, which is a bit of a shame, but you know.
Oh, it happens. It happens.
Yeah.
So how did your relationship with the SCI come about then?
So I at the end of the kind of adventure game era, if you will, I'd basically been working with Clem on a few side projects, and then Clem had been chatting with the people from Sales Curve, as it was known in those days before it became SCI, and they were very interested in finding a way to do something with CD-ROM technology. So they wanted to do some sort of, I mean, people use the phrase interactive movie, which is a terrible phrase because it's really not. But there had been a lot of talk about interactive movie stuff. They had got the license for a film called The Lawnmower Man. Lawnmower Man, which was a cool virtual reality sci-fi movie with Pierce Brosnan and Jeff Fahey. And initially they were talking to Clement about a kind of a consultancy to help them set up a studio. Now I was based in Southampton and SCI were based in London, and basically Clem hired me out to SCI to set up a studio, but because I didn't want to commute to London all the time, I set the studio up in Southampton, and recruited a bunch of people to work in the studio down here, and that became SCI's Southampton studio. And after a while, because I was effectively working for Sales Curve in everything but name, I shifted across from Clem to work for Sales Curve full time, and that's how the Southampton studio started, and we just basically expanded from there.
Oh, cool. I used to work for Sales Code actually, long before you joined, but I left about 1990. Um, yeah, so they did a lot of really good games, didn't they? So obviously, Lawnmower Man, that must have been difficult to um, visualize as a game. I mean, there was some really nice VR parts of it. So, what was your plan when you tried to make the game? Well, you made the game. Sorry.
Well, it was a strange setup, I guess,
Mm,
there because we were using a piece of authoring tech, which Clem had developed, for various things like doing interactive CD-ROM titles. Um, and we were kind of pushing it as far as it could go and then some,
mm,
because there was a very clear direction that this was supposed to be an interactive movie because it was so closely associated with the Lawnmower Man movie that was coming through. So we literally had a copy of the film to work with,
mm,
uh, some movie scripts, and I had four people who, for three of them, it was their first job in the games industry,
right.
and we basically hit the ground kind of running to try and get something together. Fortunately, some of the people that we were bringing in there were immensely talented artists and stuff.
Mm,
So we were able to get together some cool footage. But I still feel like, from a tech perspective, oh my gosh, if we'd just been a year later or something like that, if we
yeah.
had just had a little bit more coding resource rather than because there was no coders in the building. It was literally just using a piece of CD-ROM authoring software, which couldn't quite do all the things we wanted. Oh, so um, it was very much a finding your feet kind of project. But yeah, we kind of pushed what we could through that. And the game did relatively well. So
Mm,
the studio slowly expanded. We were able to actually start having a balanced development group rather than just a number of creative people sitting there using kind of um, authoring tools. We were able to actually start coding stuff,
mm,
and to broaden our ambitions a little bit in terms of what kind of projects we wanted to work on.
mm. Kingdom of Magic. So that was a very ambitious project, wasn't it? I mean, that's a bit of a return to adventuring as well. Must have been a nightmare to test as well because of the open-ended nature of it.
Yes, it was. I loved working on that.
Mm,
So uh, it was ridiculously ambitious. Uh, I kind of feel like the game almost worked the way I wanted it to. Um, uh, we had we had a number of issues with graphics processing on that, which was such a shame. But all of that aside, it was a complete nightmare for testing, because one of the things that we wanted to put in there was the notion of mobile NPC, non-player characters who could wander around,
mm,
um, interact with the environment, pick up and drop objects wherever they wanted to, get into fights, do all sorts of stuff. And
mm.
it was fantastic. It actually worked. They really did all the stuff that they were meant to do. But it did mean that if you were trying to find a particular character to make sure that you could just quickly kill him and get the object and move on, sometimes you were chasing him around the map. And yes, the test department didn't love that. Um, uh, but I still think they preferred it to the Lawnmower Man, because the Lawnmower Man was an absolute bear to finish. Whereas Kingdom of Magic, you could at least do it whilst you were eating pizza. So that kind of helped. Yeah, well, it was very ambitious, and we really went for it. And I still think that there's, obviously the visuals, when you actually get right down to it, we ended up running in a dreadful global 256 palette for the whole game, which I cannot tell you how nice it looked before we had to adopt the global 256 palette for the whole game. But that aside, there was a lot of fun stuff in there. I was very pleased with some of the jokes and scripts. I loved the notion of mobile NPC characters, even though it made it a pain to test. And some of the gags still make me smile.
Well, Carmageddon, that was a massive game, wasn't it? And very controversial at the time. So, how did you get involved with that?
So, SCI was largely the PC side of SCI was largely operating out of the Southampton studio, and we were starting to be asked to think about expanding the product portfolio by bringing in some third-party developers to work on stuff. And one of the games that we looked at was a game called, I think it was originally called 3D Destruction Derby. And it was this mad kind of Destruction Derby kind of in full 3D game. And the guys who were making it, so Patrick Buckland and Neil Barden from Stainless, were very enthusiastic and telling us about, they had these ideas and they were going to make it a lot bigger and a lot better. And myself and John Chasey, who were running the Southampton studio, were both taken by this. And Stainless were based, and still are, on the Isle of Wight. So it was quite handy from Southampton. We could just jump on the ferry and go over and see them. They weren't far away. And so, yeah, we recommended that this would be a great game to get behind. And we went over and started. I mean, our official role was co-producers on the game. So we'd go over and sit down like on a weekly or fortnightly basis over in the Isle of Wight and see how they were getting on. And every week it was great. We really, really loved what was happening in the game. As soon as it was playable, all the people in the Southampton studio became stupidly addicted to it. And it was just a fantastic fun game. In fact, we started lending them, like for the intro sequence, the intro sequence for modeling some of the cars and rendering some of the high-res versions of the in-game cars. It was actually some of the people who'd worked on Lawnmower Man helped out with that. And we just loved it. We absolutely loved it. And we also really liked the fact that Patrick and Nobby had a very irreverent outlook, and they weren't being all nicey kind of shrinking violets about stuff. They wanted to do a game that was completely mental, completely kind of politically incorrect and all the rest of it. And we did nothing to stop them. And I'm not ashamed of that. We stood by and let it happen on our watch. And I think it was the easiest project to be involved in because those guys were just on fire. They had exactly the right vision, and we loved it. It was just great.
So what happened after all that? You still were working around the games industry, aren't you? So what's happened in your career since then?
since then, myself and I've spent some time working with Clem briefly, and then John Chasey had left SCI before me and set up a mobile game studio called IOMO, which was then bought by Infospace, a big US NASDAQ listed company. And they had 3 studios, and basically they needed somebody to run the English studio. So I came in to run the English studio, working with the guys who ran the German studio and the Californian studio, and to try and unify the 3 purchases that Infospace had made. And that was going well, and I really enjoyed that. Mobile games, in some way, at that time was almost like a callback to the smaller scale games development of the 8 and 16-bit era. So I felt very at home doing that. Got to work with some enormously talented people. But then after a year or so, Infospace pivoted away from mobile content. Nothing to do with us, because we were profitable, but their business had largely involved selling ringtones back in the days when phones couldn't just download new ringtones, off the internet. So that represented a change to their broader business direction. And because we were profitable, they gave us time to basically MBO the studio. So we set up Finblade. We ran Finblade profitably for over 10 years with no exterior investment, which was really cool. Got to work on some really fun games. But after a while, the same problems that seem to kind of afflict most small indies in the industry, in as much as you've got to go big or go home. So before we got into a situation of having to close, we kind of stepped back from Finblade. But shortly thereafter, in a kind of a very serendipitous way, I got a call from my old mate, Carmageddon himself, Patrick Buckland, who said, would I be interested in, seeing as how I was still just across the water from the Isle of Wight, would I be interested in joining him and the gang over at Stainless? So for the past few years, I've been over there at Stainless. I still don't live on the Isle of Wight, so I commute on a boat when I go to work. But working with the Stainless guys is brilliant. And we get to do mobile games, we get to do console games, we get to do PC games, the whole shebang. And it feels like the right kind of place for me, because Stainless are every bit as crazy now as you'd wish for them. They're all slightly older, as am I, but the spirit of adventure and craziness has not gone. So that's what you want in your colleagues.
Excellent, yeah. So you're writing books as well, aren't you, these days? So is that like you're harking back to your early adventure writing days by doing that?
So I think I've always been interested in telling stories, and probably the text adventures was a kind of a gateway drug to book writing, I think.
Right, yeah.
So it is inevitable that at some stage you're going to just try a little book and see how you get on. You're not going to go crazy. You could stop tomorrow if you wanted to. But I started largely because one of my friends wanted to go to a creative writing evening class, but he was concerned that it's all going to be women there, and I don't want to be the only guy. So I went along as moral support, and long story short, my homework kind of got a little bit out of control for that. And I ended up with kind of most of a book. So I was encouraged by some people who know better than me to send the book off to agents and see what would happen.
Mhm.
And after a few rejection letters, they told me what I needed to fix in the book.
Right.
And as soon as I fixed it, I got an agent.
Mm.
And as soon as I got an agent, I got a publishing deal. And
Oh.
I've kind of accidentally been writing books ever since. So, um, but yeah, it's very similar in some ways, and I think it's probably the perfect balance for me, because when I started writing games, I
Mm.
could be in control of everything. I could come up with an idea. I could literally sit down at the screen, and at the end of the work, I would end up with a finished game, and it
Yeah.
was all down to my choices.
Right.
As the years went by, making a game involved more and more and more people.
Mm.
And now it's, vast.
Yeah.
The teams required are huge. Writing books is one of the last creative endeavors, I think, where somebody can literally sit down and do it themselves.
Yeah.
And it's either that or be a world famous painter, but I can't paint, or a singer songwriter, but I can't sing. So this is like the only option left to me, and I'm going to stick with it.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for chatting with us, Fergus. It's been brilliant, really entertaining. So thank you for that. Thanks for taking the time to do
Lovely to be here in my room.
that. Okay, well, you take care, mate. Thank you.
All right, cheers, Bella.
Thanks,
Let me
mate.
know if you need anything else, and hopefully the quality on the Zoom call didn't go too low.
I'm hoping I can edit it at the end, so I'll have a look at it. But I'm sure I can get something sorted out for it. So, but thank you, mate.
Excellent. All right, nice one. Cheers, and apologies again for mucking you about, and I hope it
Oh
all goes
no, no,
well.
no. It's all right. Don't worry about it, mate. Cheers
All
again,
right,
mate. Thank you.
cheers, Bella.
Bye, bye.